Party, the party of the president here, François Hollande. What happens next here for France? The president of France has said this was a war, an act of war against France. What does this mean?
Yes, it was an act of war by a very organized, militarized terrorist organization. And we have to respond in kind. We've been already very active in Syria, which is also why we were a prime target for ISIS. And we have to act on several fronts now, obviously nationally. We voted new laws recently to increase our intelligence services and the means that we can use for surveillance, and these still need to be fully rolled out. And what we learn from the investigation in the next few days, next few weeks, will tell us how to best implement those new laws so that they're as efficient as possible.
But you're saying we should react in kind. I mean, essentially, do you think, or does the Socialist Party believe here in this country that France should become more militarily involved in Syria and in Iraq?
This is definitely what should be on the table today, but we need to do that with our allies. It needs to be an international effort because no country can act efficiently on their own in Syria. It has to be a concerted effort, and we need to talk about also the transition, because we know what happens. We've seen that before. We know what happens when we just bomb an area. Not only it makes it impossible for civilians for collateral damage to control collateral damage, but on top of that, we need to have a political transition in place for after we deal with the military
To understand what the thinking and resolve will be going forward, you need to look back also. The criticism will be, why haven't you done it already? Why have the French been slow to involve themselves in Syria? Why have the French been slow to shore up their borders and deal with the vetting of refugees here?
Well, actually, when it comes to Syria, France was the first one who wanted to get involved in Syria. In 2013, François Hollande wanted to intervene already, even before ISIS became a real threat. Unfortunately, he was isolated, and we couldn't act because we needed to have an international coalition.
But there is no ground operation from the French in Syria, obviously. There are reasons for that. What are they?
No, well, because we need to have a coordinated effort in order for this to work. We know what happens. America knows that, right? You know what happened when you go all alone in a country and your liberation forces are seen as occupation forces, and this doesn't turn out very well. So it needs to be coordinated, especially with the Arab countries in the area. If we're going to put boots on the ground, it has to be with the Arab forces on the ground, also in the area, and we need to have an agreement with Russia and Iran about what the transition should be in regards to Assad.
But do you believe after an attack like this, there can be appetite in France for more of a ground force in a country like Syria or in a country like Iraq, in coordination with allies? Yes. Because from the air, we saw it even in Libya. I mean, when you have an air campaign that ends without boots on the ground,
Actually, I think in Libya, the biggest problem was the aftermath. It wasn't just the fact that there weren't enough boots on the ground. It was the fact that there was no serious political transition put in place. And this is why there's chaos in Libya. This is why we don't want this to happen again in Syria. So this is why this has to be thoughtfully prepared. It cannot be improvised.
You have what you tell your citizens to make them comfortable with what you do abroad, and then you have what you need to tell them to make them safe here at home. They hear the sirens now. They mean something different after an attack. They hear the word Islam. They hear Islamism. They hear radical. They don't know which to believe and how to parse it. They hear about refugees in human need. Then they hear about refugees who are actually terrorists. What do you tell them about how to understand the threat?
I think French people are familiar with the threat of radical Islam. They've been for a long time. The first time we were attacked by terrorists, radical Islamists, was 20 years ago. It was in relation to Algeria, of course. But, so this is something we're familiar with. What's changed now is because we're at the forefront of the war against terrorism, Islamic terrorism, all across the world, not just in Iraq and Syria, but also in Africa. We know that we have a huge target on our back. And also, contrary to what happened, very targeted, you said that before, contrary to the very targeted attacks in January, this is now the realization that we have to live with the threat of terrorism. Just like Americans, I was living in New York at the time of September 11th. I was working right next to the World Trade Center. And this is the same kind of realization that you you have to accept the fact that there's this threat that it could happen to anyone, anywhere, anytime.
Yeah. And the question is going to be, what response will be effective? What military response?
Yes.
What political response? Yeah. The refugees now, what kind of backlash will they experience?
We have an emergency decisions that were made for the next few days, maybe a few weeks, so that the investigation can move along as quickly as possible, and especially in cooperations with other European countries. We see that with Belgium right now. We know that we have to increase our capacity for intelligence cooperation at the European level, international level. And as far as the refugee crisis goes, this is actually the demonstration that we need. France has been pushing for a fully European solution in order to better control the European borders, to process refugees' applications a lot more efficiently with intelligence services, so we can detect the ones that are not legitimate applications, and make it as hard as possible for terrorists to get in through that.
Well, let's see what happens at the G20, because the expansion of the threat is now painfully obvious. The question is, what will be the expansion of the response? Thank you very much for joining us.
All right, Corinne Narassiguin, thank you for being with us. And up next, Chris mentioned the G20. Well, we'll have a report from that summit in Antalya, Turkey, where the Paris attacks are taking center stage today.